Welcome to Horizons of Thought. Today, I'm going to talk about social distancing and the kinds of work people do. I'm very fortunate. I live in New Zealand, and here in New Zealand, after 6 weeks of being locked down in our houses, 4 weeks at something called level 4, where we really had to stay within our own bubbles, and then 2 weeks where people like me who live alone got to form into another group of people. We are now basically allowed out and about. We can't form in very large groups, but we're allowed out and we can explore more. Very fortunate because the time that we were isolated from each other was relatively short, only about 6 weeks. I personally am also very fortunate because of the type of work I do. I work as a researcher, and when I cannot go to the university to do research, I can just sit and work at home, especially if I already have data. I'm at a particular time where I have a ton of papers that I can be working on. In fact, what happened during this 2 weeks is I spent some time writing a grant application. I spent a lot of time reviewing ethics and reviewing papers. And I spent a whole lot of more time working on revise and resubmits for papers that were already written up. They were sent to journals, and we'd gotten replies from various reviewers and the editors saying, this journal's not bad. It's something that can probably be published, but not in its current form. You're going to need to fix some mistakes that you've had in various places. All the coordination of these kinds of revise and resubmit tasks, it's not that difficult once you know how to do it over email, let alone over something that makes it a lot easier like Zoom meetings. So I'm very fortunate in my work. I can do that kind of work for a time, even away from a university or institution. The only time I really need to be at these institutions is if I'm teaching students, which I didn't have this semester, or if I'm actually needing to conduct direct research and collect data for experiments. Not a lot of people are that lucky, though. There's a lot of different kinds of work out there. Look, if you're really capable and you do that kind of work, it's good. A lot of people can work on novels and work on writing of various kinds at home. A lot of people can write computer programs in distributed fashion. A lot of management type decisions can be made across Zoom or Skype meetings because these decisions don't necessarily require you to be face to face. But there is a lot of work out there that cannot be done when you are locked down. If you have to be in a particular building or be in a particular place, you have to be there. You're not cleaning the floors of a building from home. You're not building new buildings from home. You're not fixing the streets. You're not building parks. You're not building tall buildings. You're not doing any of that stuff unless you gather together in groups. Some of those jobs were deemed essential in this country. If you were working in the food supply chain or you were working on groceries, you still got to keep your job in these cases. If somebody still has to clean up all the shelves in the grocery stores, because people were still going in smaller numbers, but people were still going to the grocery store to pick up their groceries, to buy new items, one at a time, yes, but it was still being done. But say you did a similar kind of job in a liquor store. Your job was gone. It wasn't deemed as essential. You couldn't do that from home. So you had to collect some kind of an unemployment benefit or some kind of what New Zealand is called a work and income benefit or an employment subsidy of some kind in order to make sure that you still had income while you were at home. A lot of jobs like this just cannot be done from home. There's also a lot of work that people do that they can't do from home because it requires a level of skill that they don't have. Human beings engage in social activity and work together in social groups in order to compensate for some basic limitations that we may have. I can't understand how to do this particular problem at work. I go and call my buddy. My buddy actually does that kind of work. And if you need to do this in a physical environment, a shared space, you can't really get the job done if you don't have that social environment. And the truth is, those kinds of jobs that require direct interaction with your environment, where you're building things with your hands or repairing things or working on particular sites, and the kinds of jobs where you're very much dependent on your social interactions in the now, in the moment, because you might not all have the same skills, these jobs are dominated by people who make less money in the world. They are in more precarious situations because people who can work from anywhere are always in less of a precarious situation than people who need to be particularly somewhere to get their work done. So what ends up happening in any lockdown situation over time is, from an employment point of view, the poor suffer first. We all have our mental illnesses and our mental issues when we cannot be together, because humans are social beings. But when you add on to that this is the way you derive your self-worth, this is the way you derive your livelihood, this is what you do to make sure you get to eat food, this adds a whole lot of pressure to people. And this kind of pressure, it predominantly affects those who tend to make less in our society to begin with. On top of that, we were lucky here in New Zealand because of the short length of time that we're doing this. We're still going to suffer economically in this country as a result of having shut down major sectors of our economy for 4 weeks. But after that initial level 4, a lot of those sectors opened back up. And right now in New Zealand, the ones that are still going to be the most impacted are tourism and flying. Our national airline, Air New Zealand, has basically said it's not going to be an international carrier anymore. They had their flights drop to 1% of their normal total. They weren't making the kind of profit where they could lose 99% of their revenue stream and still be able to maintain their planes, maintain their operations. And when they come back, they don't have the staff, they don't have the planes, they don't have the operation. They won't be able to be the big international carrier that they were before unless they are essentially subsidized by our government, and on top of that, given some time to rebuild that infrastructure that already got damaged from just the time that they're down. And their situation is made worse because even though we are allowed out to travel inside New Zealand, people cannot come into the country, and we cannot easily go out of the country unless we have a really good cause. This is because this particular pandemic that's affecting the world, while it is largely gone from New Zealand and probably will be in about 3 to 4 weeks, it is not largely gone from the world. It is everywhere, growing still exponentially in many countries in the world, making travel in and out of this country particularly dangerous and difficult, especially since we made the choice to essentially end this particular virus from being endemic in the country, to essentially destroy the virus in the country. So businesses that rely on tourism, businesses that rely on international travel of people to come into our area or for us to go out into other areas, these businesses will still suffer greatly. But what's likely going to happen in New Zealand in the next few weeks is, and the next few months, and even over the next couple of years, is we're going to be ramping up agriculture, we're going to be ramping up manufacturing and filling in the gaps that were made in tourism and in travel in our economy with new economic ventures, because this is an island that's healthy and relatively disease-free in comparison to the world. You can't lock down an island for 6 weeks without getting rid of a lot more than the particular pandemic. I would likely venture to guess that we probably don't have colds or flus for the most part in this country either. These kinds of gains are really, really good for productivity in general. They're really good for what we're going to want to do to actually rebuild our economy in other areas. The rest of the world's not so lucky. They're not in an island in the middle of the Pacific, separated from people. They're not run under a government that's largely trusted by the majority of the population and to which almost all of the population is willing to obey and listen to. A lot of the world is interconnected. It's full of a lot of different groups of people. It's full of a lot of different geography. A disease can enter the country and affect big cities first, and then only months later affect smaller areas or travel across the country. When you're running a country this big, even if you were good at your job, you're still stuck in a situation that locking down people is going to take longer than it will in a place like New Zealand or Australia. And the longer you lock down people, the worse the problem gets for the general economy. People who need to be in groups have their mental health deteriorate, have their ability to feed themselves deteriorate, have their economics deteriorate, have their life's dreams and goals, in the case of people who started their own businesses, vanish right before their eyes. The number of people I've seen who've literally said, everything I've worked for my whole life is gone. I have nothing anymore that I've worked for. I have myself and I have my family, but there's no business. All this business that I built up is gone, and I'm not getting it back. I don't know what I'm going to do for a living next. I've seen that a lot. I've seen, even in this country, people who weren't already particularly mentally stable in isolation really lose it and do things. Colleagues I know who've worked in grocery stores have dealt with violence, and they were lucky because they had mall security and other people who could take care of the violent people and get them away so they themselves weren't hurt. But it's the kind of thing that happens more and more and more as you isolate people and put them in circumstances where they don't know how they're going to survive. Some people find a way to handle that, find other sources of help, but some people they can't, and they really start to lose it. So what we're going to start seeing in the world is, my guess, is you're going to see more and more places that can't sustain high levels of lockdown. They're going to be opening up more and more. We've seen these reports in the news, and there's going to be a lot of difficulty in relationship to how are they going to balance the now increasing again number of viral infections related to the current pandemic in the world versus how are they going to have enough of an economy to make sure that everybody is able to feed themselves and take care of themselves. This is the place we're at now in this world, and it's not the easiest thing to figure out at all. Personally, I'm very glad I'm not in charge of one of these bigger countries that has an awful lot of work to do and an awful lot of different people to get along and make understanding. Here at Horizons of Thought, my job is just to get people to think about all of the issues that are involved, so that when they can imagine themselves being in charge of a place like this, they can imagine all of the difficulties it would have and maybe be a little less judgmental when leaders of bigger countries are not particularly good at dealing with something like a giant worldwide pandemic, because it's just harder job for them than it is for those of us who live on smaller islands. I have to say, though, I'm very, very glad I live in New Zealand, and I'm very proud of our government here. I'm honored to be here, and I'm honored to have watched them do a really good job on what is still a very difficult situation, even here in this country. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Horizons of Thought. If you liked the episode, please click like. If you didn't like the episode, please click dislike. In any case, if you got any comments about this episode, go to the comment section and write your comments. So if you've got suggestions of future things, if you've got things that you think I really should have talked about even in this simple overview and didn't, maybe I can do a follow-up video on the topic. If you've got some arguments to have, we'll be happy to discuss back and forth. If there's enough in there, I'll still write a video where we talk about some of the comments that I've gotten over time. If you really want to support this channel, please go below and go to the donor box. Click on that. You can subscribe to the channel. You can do a one-off contribution to the channel, or you can do a monthly subscription. If you do a monthly subscription, I provide benefits based on the level of that subscription. But in any case, please keep suggestions coming. Give me ideas for new videos to do. I'm happy to talk about, as you can tell just from this channel, this is my 13th episode. I'm happy to talk about nearly any topic imaginable, especially if it touches on the kinds of policies that affect the world. Because what I really want for people is for them to understand just how complicated and just how difficult it is to make good policy in this world, and to understand why people and politicians make the decisions that they make. Thank you, and good evening. I will see you in a few days.